Right, so as we often say with these sessions, perfectly fine to ask questions as they come up in your mind as we're going through these slides. You don't have to wait to the end, and sometimes it makes more sense to ask them as they come in your mind because they're a bit more relevant. And I'm more than happy to kind of go off on a tangent if we need to. So get stuck in with questions and comments. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at who is entitled to have an IMCA. And when we talk about IMCA entitlement, there's two words that we use which are a duty and a power. Now, the difference between a duty and a power is the difference between must and a should. And if you remember, we kind of say this a lot in advocacy, whenever you see the word duty or the word must in the guidance, you can get excited because that means that the local authority or the NHS or whoever the body is, they don't get a choice about it, they have to do that. And with IMCA, there are a couple of decisions where it's a duty, so it's a must. If the person hits certain criteria, the decision maker, so the local authority or the NHS body, they must instruct an IMCA. And then the power is they can, they should. So there are two other decisions where they can or they should instruct an IMCA. But we're gonna kind of nail them today, so you're exactly clear about what they both involve. And then we'll finish the session looking at the IMCA role. And again, if you've been in our sessions, you'll know that we are great believers in advocacy being advocacy, that the advocacy role is the same, whether you're an IMCA, an IMHA, a non-statutory community advocate, a self-advocate, it's the same. Advocacy is advocacy. But what we'll do is we'll apply that to the specifics around working as a IMCA. Right, okay, so a bit of background. Mental Capacity Act is, gosh, quite old now, 2005. And this was the first time an IMCA, a statutory advocate for adults, was ever introduced in law. And what the whole point of IMCA, the whole point of Mental Capacity Act is about giving a framework to make decisions and to support people to make decisions where they have capacity, kind of issues with capacity. And one of the key things when we make decisions, when the state makes a decision on behalf of somebody who doesn't have the capacity to do it themselves, is about involving people who know them. And that's really to make sure that the person's voice is represented. Now, when they were writing the Mental Capacity Act, there was a recognition that for some people, and albeit, you know, a small number of people, they don't actually have anybody who isn't paid, who's involved in their life. And for that group of people, they felt that an advocate was needed to ensure that they were represented through the process, and that the people who were paid to care for them kind of didn't take over in that sense, and that there was someone independent to represent them. So we're talking about a small number of people who don't have any natural allies, any family or friends who can consult on their behalf. So it is a small number out of all the statutory advocacy types we've got in England and Wales. IMCA is by far the narrowest criteria, and it's the smallest number of people. And what an IMCA does is we work with and we support people who have been assessed as lacking capacity to make certain decisions. And the whole point of an IMCA is essentially to be that person's voice. So you are there to represent their views to the decision maker who is going to make a best interest decision. Now, at this early point in the session, I'm going to introduce the idea that is not the same as the IMCA making the best interest decision. You're definitely not there to make decisions, and you're definitely not there to promote best interests. That's the job of the decision maker. And as an advocate, we would never be about promoting best interests. What we are about is about promoting the views of the person and what is important to them, which may or may not be in their best interests. In a sense, we don't have to concern ourselves with that. What we're concerned with is the views and wishes of the person, in order for the person making the best interest decision to make sure that they're included. Any questions or comments so far? I'll just pause for a sec. Okay, can't see any comment through. I'll move on, but do chuck them in if you've got them. Right, so with the Mental Capacity Act, we've got a code of practice, and the code of practice makes it absolutely clear that you must be independent, and that means independent from the local authority, from the NHS, and from the care provider. And that's essential in all of advocacy, isn't it? And that's because you want to focus your support and attention on the person. You want to be able to represent the person in any best interest discussions. And because your goal is the person, you want to be able to help them with information so that they can make decisions. And then also you're providing information to the decision maker who's making decisions. And then, of course, you've got to be independent, because if you are concerned about the decision, or you might be concerned about the process, then you need to raise that as an issue and ultimately challenge things if you don't feel that they've been done correctly. So we're very independent in the name of the job, isn't it? Okay, so now we're going to have a little look at when there's a duty to refer and a power. So Melanie, I can see you've raised your hand. Just get stuck in with your questions if you want to. I don't know if your hand was raised on accident. I'll just pause a second if you did have a question. Hit by mistake. Thanks. Don't worry. Right. So duty and a power. So the first one is where there's a duty, and this should be actually fairly straightforward. So it's not for discussion. It's kind of not, oh, we fancy having an IMCA, or wouldn't it be helpful to have an advocate? No, this is absolutely clear. If the person hits these criteria, then they have to. It's a duty. They have to appoint an IMCA. So the two decisions are serious medical treatment and long-term accommodation moves. So if that's one of the decisions being made and the person doesn't have capacity to make that decision, and they don't have anyone who can act in what we call the consultee role, then an IMCA has to be instructed. So it's a duty that they have to get an IMCA in. Now, there's a couple of things in here that we need to unpick that we're going to, like what's serious medical treatment, what's a long-term accommodation move, what's a consultee. So we'll just spend a little bit of time looking at that. But before we do, I just wanted to throw this in. The power, so this is where they can instruct an IMCA. This is where there's a decision about an accommodation review. So if you think about the kind of the decision-making process, so you've had somebody who's had a long-term change of accommodation decision, and then there's a review of that decision. So it could be, say, they've moved into a residential setting for the first time. You've been involved in the IMCA through that process. And then 6 weeks later, there's a review to see whether that was the right move, and has the person settled okay? Are they happy there? Or are there problems with this move? So that first accommodation review, what the Mental Capacity Act says is that you don't have to have an IMCA. However, if they think it's in the person's best interest to have an IMCA, then they can. And where that works really sensibly well is when you've had an IMCA involved with the change of accommodation, and it's been either a contentious decision or a big change, then it makes sense for the IMCA to get involved in that first accommodation review. The other one is within adult safeguarding processes. Now, I'm going to come to this a bit later, but for now, it's enough for you to just know that the Care Act advocacy functions kind of supersede the IMCA entitlement. And I will go a little bit, explain that a bit later, but adult safeguarding should now be treated as Care Act advocacy, not IMCA. Right, I will return to that. Tony, I think you had your hand up. Did you have a question? People, you don't need to put your hands up if you've got a question. Just chuck questions in or comments, and I'll pick them up. I've got the chat box open my end. Right, so let's have a little look at the two criteria. So the consultee role basically means that you've got somebody who can offer a view on what should happen. That's essentially what a consultee role is. Like I said before, most people have got a family member or a friend who can take on that role. For those people who don't, then this is where we might be thinking about IMCA. So where the person doesn't have somebody who can offer that, take on that consultee role, then they need to be thinking about IMCA. It is ultimately the decision maker's decision on whether somebody is appropriate to take on that role. And the capacity test, sorry, not the capacity test, the decision about is somebody appropriate to consult. The Mental Capacity Act gives a list of guidance around what makes somebody appropriate or what makes somebody inappropriate. And essentially, it's common sense stuff. It's common sense stuff that when sorry, I've just seen Tony's question in the Q&A. It's distracting me a little bit. So somebody appropriate to consult is that they know the person well, that they're not, there's no concerns around safeguarding. So let's say, Mrs. Perkins has got a son where there's concerns that he's been financially abusing her. He wouldn't be classed as appropriate to consult. Anybody paid to care for the person isn't classed as appropriate to consult with either. And the person's got to agree to do it. So if the person doesn't want to act in that role, then that's okay. What the Capacity Act says is that's okay. So that's kind of appropriate to consult. And most people, as we said, have somebody who can take on that role. The second criteria is that they've been assessed as lacking capacity to make that decision at that particular time. And by the time an IMCA gets involved, that should be formally recorded. Now, in the olden days, when IMCA first started, it used to be like a requirement that you'd see the capacity test. I think we're a bit more flexible about that now. You don't physically need to see the capacity test, but you need to ask that question on referral. Have they been assessed lacking capacity? And essentially, I think the reason for that is to check that assumptions aren't being made about the person because of a condition, and that consideration has been given before IMCA involvement. That, how's this person going to be supported to have capacity? And so only until they've established that the person lacks capacity should an IMCA get involved. Right, Tony, I'm going to come to your question now. So you've said the first review after an accommodation move is an IMCA role, not a Care Act. Now, the problem with lots of things in life is about language. And the problem we've got in advocacy is the word review. So the word review is used to describe all kinds of things. It's used to describe, a review of a care plan, a review of an accommodation move, a review of a decision, a review of a protective measure. The word review is really problematic. So whenever you hear the word review, ask what's it reviewing. Now, if it's reviewing an accommodation move, so I'm just going to shut the door. I can hear my kids. Sorry about that. If it's about a review of an accommodation move where the person lacks capacity and there's an IMCA involved, that to me would be IMCA. I would totally take it on as an IMCA. If it's a review of a care and support plan, then that's Care Act. Now, I've said all of that to kind of give you the technical bit and that's the bottom line. The reality, of course, is who gives a shit? The person's not really going to care whether it's a Care Act advocate or an IMCA. So just be flexible in that approach. If, as long as there's an advocate there, I think, we do it. The only thing I think you really need to be careful of is about making sure the time you spend is being allocated to the right contract, because it might be funded from different people. And whilst, I think the odd bit of work won't matter, but if you're consistently doing a lot of safeguarding under the guise of an IMCA, then that's going to skew your data for how much Care Act advocate involvement. Does that make sense? So kind of there is strict criteria that we can use. That said, who cares? Make sure the person's got an advocate and do whatever you can to make sure they're supported. And then the third bit is just make sure it's recorded in the right way. that kind of makes sense? I hope that kind of answers your question. So Tony said, so if the person lacking the capacity of having reviewed their care plan, is it appropriate for me to state what I think they would have thought about their care plan if they had capacity based on evidence I've gathered? Of course, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what an advocate would do in non-instructed advocacy. So in non-instructed advocacy, we're thinking, aren't we, around what would this person be saying if they had capacity? If they were able to make this decision, what decision do I think that they would make? And that all has to be evidence, of course. We're not just walking into somebody's life and making assumptions about them. We've got to research that and be evidence-based about it. But yeah, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. Yeah. So another comment's come through. So on the chat box, guys, just a little, just check that the drop-down box says all panelists and attendees, because if you hit it to all panelists, I'm the only one who can see it. So I'll just read out the question, which says, am I right in saying that the capacity assessment should be done each time a decision is to be made? Sometimes capacity is assumed based on an assessment being done a couple of years beforehand for a similar issue. Yes, you're absolutely spot on. So with capacity, we call the capacity test time and decision specific. So time specific means, does this person lack capacity at this time to make this specific decision? That's the kind of the full question. And again, like if ever you hear somebody say, oh, they lack capacity, we should quickly be following that up with a in what? What is it? Because unless you're in a coma, nobody lacks capacity in everything. If you're unconscious, then yes, you lack capacity to make decisions. Otherwise, capacity is, it's time and decision specific. Some people will be able to make, some people will be able to have capacity in the morning when they're alert and fresh and they've eaten and they've been out for a walk. These things will help somebody have capacity. The same person in the afternoon or after medication, or if they're being tired, if they're feeling tired, the capacity might be very different. So that's why we say it's time specific. But yeah, if you come across an assessment that's a couple of years old, I'd be asking for a reassessment. And it doesn't have to be years, a couple of weeks if something's changed. So it could be a good example of this, could be somebody who's been receiving some medication that's impacted on their ability to make decisions and have capacity. Beginning of the month, they might not have capacity, but now that they've been on medication, and perhaps that they're being a bit more settled, or it's having an impact on their impairment, then they might regain capacity. So we've got to just be, that's one of the kind of the first things as an advocate, we're checking, do we think that they've got capacity? Okay, I think that kind of covers the comments and questions so far. So great questions, guys. Keep them coming in. So back to the criteria for IMCA. Does this all make sense? So the person lacks somebody who is appropriate to take on the consultee role. And then the second one is that they've been assessed as lacking capacity to make the decision. I'm just thinking if there's anything. Oh, and the consultee role, I think I said, it's not like a really involved role. It's basically somebody who's got a view on what should happen. It's a very it's a low threshold. We're not asking the person to be making decisions, to be doing supported decision making. We're just asking them to have a view. What do they think should happen? What do they think the person would want to happen? Okay, so now we're going to have a little look at what is meant by serious medical treatment. Has anybody heard of the phrase serious medical treatment? So you might have seen the acronym like SMT. So it just means serious medical treatment. Brilliant. Nice one, mates. So the Code of Practice for the Mental Capacity Act gives us some guidance on what constitutes medical treatment. There isn't a clear definition, or there isn't a list of things that constitute medical treatment. And the reason for that is because treatments can change. So if you think about some treatments, some very invasive treatments, let's say for cancer, they evolve, don't they, and develop. And whereas 10 years ago, the side effects, the consequences of having that treatment would be very, very negative and serious. Now it's changed. So it might not have such serious consequences, or the side effects of can be fixed in a way, or being reduced and lessened. And equally, the same medical treatment might have a very, very different impact between person A and person B. So if you're terrified of needles, then having a simple flu jab, for instance, it becomes very, very difficult. Dentist work for some people will be a serious medical treatment, because they might have to have like restraint or chemical. They might have to be anaesthetized. That then makes the dental work a serious medical treatment, whereas for another person, they'd be able to cope with it and fine. So there isn't a list of kind of definitive things which constitute SMT. Instead, what we've got is guidance, and it's defined as any treatment. And treatment doesn't just mean the administration of treatment. It also includes withholding, so not giving the person treatment, or withdrawing, and that's really, really pertinent in end of life decisions, or the withdrawal of artificial nutrition and hydration. They'll be likely to be serious medical treatments. So whenever we're looking at giving somebody withdrawing or withholding treatment, where one of these three things happens. The first one is where there's one treatment available, and there's a fine balance between benefits and burdens. So you'll hear this phrase, benefits and burdens, the pros and the cons of this one treatment. Can you think of any decisions where there's one treatment available and there's a fine balance between benefits and burdens? Just kind of thinking off the top of your head. Let's get your brains working. Any suggestions, any examples where you can think of where there's a single treatment? Tooth extraction, brilliant example. Yeah. Amputation, yes. Well, amputation, it might be, but there may be alternatives to amputation. There may be alternatives to ECT. I'll come to ECT in a second, Linda, but yeah, great. So these, whereas I think and tooth extraction, let's say you've got a pain in, there's a decayed tooth. There often isn't any other alternatives than to remove the tooth. But let's say you've got diabetes and they're thinking of amputating, your foot, or there's been an accident. They might look at other alternatives where there's a choice. If there isn't a choice, well then yeah, that's going to be a single treatment. Does that all kind of make sense? But if there is a choice of treatment, let's say to the organ transplant, to do an organ transplant, heart bypass, or to treat it with medication, they might look at medication. So there's a choice of options. If the choices are finely balanced, then that will constitute an SMT. And the third one is if what is proposed is likely to involve serious consequences. Now, all the things you've put down here, the amputation, the organ transplant, the heart bypass, they would all hit, example C, which is serious. Anything that's irreversible, like an amputation, that's likely to have serious consequences. So would class as serious medical treatment. But it can be also be things that you might not automatically think of, like a flu jab, like the COVID vaccination, for instance. Do you think a COVID vaccination would class as serious medical treatment? Is a good question for you. Do you think? So everyone have a little go. And don't worry about getting it wrong. We're here to learn. No problem if you get it wrong. So do we think COVID vaccination are serious medical treatments? So we've had a couple of people say no. Emily said there's some people yes. A couple of people have said yes. So we've got all bases covered, as they say. Nea's got a more sorry, I've lost some of these great comments. Some people saying yes, some telling if you need to restrain somebody, it could be. You need to consider adverse effects. And he said, we are accepting as an IMCA SMT as it would, if it would cause distress and use restraint. Other people saying no. Okay, great. So some people kind of given a bit of the thought. Claire said if the person is phobic of needles. Nee said it for some, yes, if it involves. Okay, great. So yeah, the answer is for some, it might constitute SMT, and it's really about this kind of first this first scenario, because there's a single treatment, to have the COVID vaccination or not. So there's no other option available, is there, to be vaccinated? But we're looking at the balance between the benefits and the burdens. So let's say that you've got somebody who is phobic of needles, or they don't like going to the doctors, and they kind of freak out every time they go to the doctors, or if they see somebody like COVID, they get very anxious. This could be somebody with a learning disability, or dementia, where they get very confused about where they are, they're not understanding, they don't like people touching them, that can be very invasive. Now, for most people, that's not going to happen. For most people, they're going to tolerate the injection, so it would just be a best interest decision. Is it in the person's best interest to have the COVID vaccination? And it's kind of straightforward. But for people who there's like an extra layer of complications to the person, as I say, they might be phobic or very distressed. And as some people have put in the comment box, which is brilliant to read, if the decision makers are starting to think, do we need to restrain the person, whether that's through, like a sedative, or whether that's through mechanical means or holding, then it's when we see the burdens are suddenly kind of being escalated, and that should be then treated as an SMT decision and should trigger IMCA. But I've got to admit, we're talking small numbers, so there'd be I'd be really concerned if anyone said no, never, or if anyone said yes all the time. It's kind of neither of those extremes. For some people, it might be an SMT, but as I say, I think it will be very, very few, because even if it is a serious medical treatment, most of those people will have somebody to consult on their behalf with. So then IMCA wouldn't get involved anyway. Does that kind of make sense? And give us a shout out if there's any confusion around that. If we're going to move on, so assuming that there isn't, but please do say if there is. Looking at number C, so this criteria around what is a serious consequence? What do we mean by serious consequence? Because for one person, being allergic to eggs, for instance, is going to give them an anaphylactic shock if they have that injection. Versus somebody, so there's all kind of, what does that mean, serious consequences? So the code of practice does give us a bit more guidance. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to that. Oh, sorry, I thought I had a slide on serious consequences. No, I haven't. The things around serious consequences is this: it would be irreversible. So anything that's like an amputation or a transplant, teeth extraction would be irreversible. Or if it would cause serious distress. So things like, if somebody's got high levels of anxiety or a learning disability, that means that they would not be able to tolerate the treatment on offer. So something like an endoscopy, that often is a serious medical treatment, like kind of, even though it's not treatment, it's not like it's medication for something, but it's like exploratory work, then that could be an SMT, because the person might not be able, they really struggle to have the procedure. Okay, right. Let's have a little look at exclusions. So somebody mentioned about ECT. Now ECT, even though it kind of hits A, B, and C, it's not included normally in IMCA, because the authorization for ECT, if it's for mental health, will come from the Mental Health Act. So any treatment that's given for mental disorder will be treated under the Mental Health Act, so IMCA wouldn't get involved. If they're looking at ECT for as a treatment that isn't authorised under the Mental Health Act, then yes, an IMCA will get involved. I've never known ECT to be given for a non-Mental Health Act issue. That's not to say that it couldn't be, But yeah, it wouldn't, if it's being authorised in the Mental Health Act, it would be IMCA, not IMCA. And then the other exclusion is a kind of common sense one. So that's about emergency treatment. So if somebody's having emergency treatment, they are not going to stop administering that emergency treatment to consult with an IMCA. Of course not. So the Mental Capacity Act doesn't exclude professionals from doing that. But as soon as the emergency treatment stops and then the planning begins for kind of future decisions, that's when they need to consider IMCA. Right, here's some examples, but I can't stress this enough, this is not a definitive list, so just to give you an idea of some things that would be serious medical treatments. Okay, before we look at long-term change in accommodation, any questions around SMT? I'll just pause for a second if there are. Okay, not seeing any come through, so we'll move on. And if you do have any questions, we can pick them up at the end if that's helpful. So, change of accommodation, dead easily defined. Linda said it has ECT on that list. Let me go back. Yeah, as long as, so ECT, as long as it's not authorised for the mental disorder under the Mental Health Act. But I've never known, I don't know, has anybody ever come across ECT being given? I don't know if it's used for other brain impairments like epilepsy, or I really don't know. I'm not medical. I'm literally making this up. No, I'm not making up. But yeah, I potentially I can imagine a scenario where ECT might be used for a non-Mental Health Act related condition. But I've never known it. So and if it's authorised under the Mental Health Act, then it's definitely not IMCA because it's come under the Mental Health Act. Yeah, I'm going on, aren't I? Yeah, I'll shut up now. Right, change of accommodation. Dead easy. It's when somebody is being moved into accommodation where the local authority is arranging it, and it's going to be for more than 8 weeks, or if the NHS is arranging it and it's going to be for more than 28 days, then that's going to be classed as a long-term change of accommodation. So it's kind of, it's simply about the number of days the person is expected to stay here. Now, if the person is going to go into respite, so it might be just for a week, that wouldn't be a long-term change of accommodation. However, if once they're in that accommodation and then there's problems, let's say the family, refuse to accept the person home again, or there's been a change in circumstances, their conditions deteriorated. If that week then turns into 8 weeks, at the point it turns into 8 weeks, or the point it's known it will become 8 weeks or longer, then it becomes a change of accommodation. And that's sometimes missed. So respite or short term, which then kind of, meanders into, it turns into a long-term change of accommodation, then an IMCA might be triggered. And then the review, as we said, is where the accommodation was arranged under that criteria, and then it's going to be reviewed. So this is what the Code of Practice said. So it's a review of the accommodation move, which may also coincide with a review of the person's care and support package. That to me would make sense. But the IMCA is there, could be there, the specific accommodation review. So that should make sense. And it doesn't matter what type of accommodation, that could be a local authority funded care home. It could be shared lives. It could be supported living. It could be extra care housing. Anything, could be a hospital, If the person is the local authority of the NHS are arranging that placement, then an IMCA. And if somebody's coming out of a mental health hospital, so this is where it can get a bit tricky as well. If the person is being discharged from a mental health hospital and it's not safe for them to go home, and the local authority are arranging that accommodation, well, then that could be an IMCA as well for the accommodation move. It's the same criteria. Anywhere where the local authority is looking out for more than 8 weeks. Any questions on this? Or I'm going to move on. Okay, so now we're going to have a little look at the safeguarding. So I mentioned before around Care Act advocacy kind of supersedes it. So under the Mental Capacity Act, remember it's not a duty to instruct an IMCA. So for safeguarding, it's what we said is a power. So what was happening with IMCA is that some IMCAs were being instructed at the beginning of the safeguarding inquiry. Some IMCAs were getting instructed kind of halfway through. Some IMCAs were just getting invited to the best interest meeting. Some IMCAs were getting invited after the best interest meeting to kind of review what the protective measures and how they were going. So there was all of this inconsistency, and it kind of, you might see that as a great thing that was given flexibility to the local authority about when an IMCA was to get involved. But it was very hodgepodgey. You know, it was kind of at the discretion of the local authority. Now, Care Act advocacy doesn't have that. Care Act advocacy is absolutely clear that it is triggered the moment the inquiry is initiated. So as soon as that inquiry, as soon as the Safeguarding Board say, yes, we're going to do a safeguarding inquiry, they need to consider advocacy. And if the person faces substantial difficulty, then an advocate should be offered. Now, if the person lacks capacity, they're automatically going to hit that substantial difficulty threshold. So everyone who lacks capacity, who is going through a safeguarding inquiry, they should be thinking about Care Act, or they have to be thinking about Care Act advocacy. Do they have anyone who can help them to be involved in that decision? So that's why we say Care Act advocacy supersedes IMCA. It's not replacing it, because technically the Mental Capacity Act hasn't changed. You know, that power to instruct an IMCA is still there. Technically, the local authority can instruct an IMCA. However, they have to instruct a Care Act advocate, because the Care Act advocacy isn't a power. Care Act advocacy is a duty. So my point would be, if you've got to instruct a Care Act advocate, why the blinking heck would you have an IMCA? It doesn't make any sense to me, because you've got to have a Care Act advocate. So that's kind of why we say Care Act advocacy for adult safeguarding now. Now, the only exception to this is if there's an alleged perpetrator who lacks capacity, because the Mental Capacity Act, IMCA, it offers the alleged victim who lacks capacity an advocate, and it also offers an IMCA to the alleged perpetrator if they lack capacity. Now, the Care Act advocacy functions, it's all for the adult with the care who would be subject to the safeguarding inquiry, not the alleged perpetrator. Oh, did my internet go then? I just lost everyone. Can I get a shout out? Are people still with me? Yeah, you're chopping in and out. I think my internet might have gone. Are we back? We're back. Okay. Did you get all of that around the alleged perpetrator? Yeah. Yeah, my presentation's gone. I'm going to just open it in a sec. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay. So we've covered the alleged perpetrator would still be entitled to an IMCA. Oh, no. Okay, you need me to repeat that. Okay, let me share my screen, and then I'll just take that again. Bum, bum, bum. Here we go. Right. So I was talking to myself in 5 minutes, wasn't I, about the alleged perpetrator. So the Mental Capacity Act gives advocacy, gives IMCAs to the alleged victim who lacks capacity and the alleged perpetrator if they lack capacity. Now, Care Act is just for the adult who's going through the safeguarding process, not the alleged perpetrator. So that could be a case where you have an IMCA involved in safeguarding. I'm going to kind of just reiterate an earlier point around the reviews. it's not something I'm going to kind of get like really, really strict about. And if I was an advocate or I was managing an advocacy service, I wouldn't be too, you know, upset if an IMCA did the safeguarding advocacy instead of the Care Act, because it's about making sure people have an advocate. Where it's going to become a problem is in funding and monitoring, and I do think monitoring matters dreadfully. You know, not matters dreadfully, it matters significantly that we're monitoring what we're doing with our time. So if all of your advocacy and safeguarding fall under the IMCA contract, it's going to kind of skew the data and the numbers. So I'd be careful of that. Emily said, where does self-neglect fall? In what way, Emily? Just give me a bit more about that. So self-neglect is a type of safeguarding concern, particularly if it would be serious self-neglect. So things like hoarding and self-neglect. So that could be raised as a safeguarding issue. And if the local authority were going to do a safeguarding inquiry, that would be treated as safeguarding. Emily said, I wasn't sure if they are a perpetrator against themselves. Okay, so yeah, technically they're at risk of self-neglect. So that would be a safeguarding inquiry if it was serious self-neglect. You know, we're not talking about somebody perhaps who was choosing to, and this is where values come into it, you know, about what cleanliness is, but we're talking about serious self-neglect where people are at risk of being harmed, really, you know, so things like hoarding or like there was one lady, just to give an example of self-neglect, I'm aware of lately where I think she was living in her bathroom. So that would be self-neglect. She wasn't clean, she was eating sandwiches and cold tins off the bathroom floor, you know, those types of things. That would be serious self-neglect. So yeah, you're right to kind of pick up, there isn't always a perpetrator, it could be themselves. Yeah, I know, Mix. Yeah. Right, okay. So, any questions around safeguarding? So, or is that clear? Safeguarding Care Act, unless it's prepared, but honest, the amount of alleged perpetrators who lack capacity and don't have anyone around to support them, yeah, that quantity is very, very low. So it's not something I would expect in every IMCA to be doing regularly at all. You know, the majority of work as an IMCA is definitely change of accommodation decisions, and serious medical treatment decisions. Okay, let's move on to the IMCA role. So we often use this. Before I show you the picture, this is what the Code of Practice says about the IMCA role. I'm just showing you because it's like there's loads, just loads of stuff here. But basically, you know, we're gonna group this into headers, simple headers of find out what's important to your partner and then fight for it. You know, if this person wants to live at home, fight for them to live at home. If this person, you know, the most important thing to them is a cat, then fight for them to have their cat to live with them. Or similarly, if this person doesn't want medical treatment, or they do want the medical treatment, that's what we're fighting for. It's you are the person's, you know, you are them, you're their voice. So this is what the Code of Practice is all getting at. So yes, you know, research information, spending time with the person, accessing records, all those types of things. But the bottom line is that you as the IMCA are there to represent the person's wishes and feelings. Okay, so I've had a specific question that says, where is the direction that safeguarding is now a Care Act referral? So there isn't a strict direction because the Care Act didn't amend the Mental Capacity Act. So everything in the Mental Capacity Act is still the same. So the local authority can still, if they want to, instruct an IMCA if the other criteria is met. But what I'm saying today is Care Act, which came in 10 years later, introduces an advocate much earlier in the process, and Care Act advocacy is a duty. So IMCA, it was a power, so they can if they think it's helpful. Care Act, it's a duty. So my point is, if there's a duty to have a Care Act advocate, why would you have an IMCA? It doesn't make any sense. But to have an IMCA, technically you'd need to have a Care Act advocate there already, and then the IMCA. So that's kind of why we say. So I hope, does that make sense? Yeah, got it, brilliant. Okay, so it's not, and again, you're not going to get into trouble. You know, this isn't kind of, you know, I can think of a lot worse things that I've done that you know, I regret than working as an IMCA when it should have been Care Act. But if we were doing this all of the time, then I think it would be an issue. So that's why we kind of mentioned it today. Victor said, it's a nice thing, the Care Act advocacy, as they can support the person throughout the process, start to finish. Totally agree. IMCA is like uber narrow, yeah, because it's about two decisions. It's about the safe medical treatment and the accommodation review, yeah, or the accommodation review. And if I just kind of bring it back to this slide, all of these things that you're reading here is what you do as an advocate anyway. But with IMCA, it's just about those two decisions. It's always about those two decisions. So it's really, really narrow. Care Act advocacy is kind of the opposite. The way Care Act advocacy should work, and I say should because it doesn't always work like this, is it should be a long-term relationship, Care Act and independent professional advocacy in Wales, it's a longer-term relationship where you're supporting people through the long-term process of assessment, planning and review. So the idea is that you're kind of with them through all those processes. IMCA, really, really narrow, you're in and out. Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to the IMCA role. So all these things in the code of practice, nothing in here is controversial, I don't think. But this is the way I think of advocacy, you know, much more simple. We've got 3 circles. We're always, no matter what type of advocacy, we're thinking about self-advocacy. And at first glance, you might think that's a bit odd with IMCA because the person lacks capacity. But I would still say IMCAs should start with self-advocacy. You know, we should start with going in and with no assumptions about what the person can and can't do. We should go in as an IMCA looking for opportunities for our partner to make decisions and express themselves and put forward what's important to them. That's all self-advocacy, isn't it? Now, if the person doesn't want to do that or can't do that because of capacity, then we'll move to representational advocacy. And for IMCA, I think you do more representational advocacy than other types because of the capacity. But I wouldn't start there, if that makes sense. Start with your self-advocacy, then move through representational. And the big, or you tell me actually, when do you think the big moment for your representation kind of comes when you're doing IMCA work? Do you think that there's a moment where there's a kind of a climax point, if you will, about where you do your representation, where you've gathered all this information, then you represent it? And Mitz has got it. Yes, it's your report. So when you're being an IMCA and undertaking IMCA support, you will be culminate your work in a report. And in the report, you're going to be putting exactly what the person wants and fighting for that choice to really be considered. And I'm just going to make the distinction here that you are never ever saying what should happen. You as an IMCA, you don't have a view on what should happen. You're not the decision maker. So even if it's really bloody obvious what should happen, you still don't say what should happen. That's not your job. Our job is to represent our partner. So we're not saying you should do this has to be the decision, or, you know, we recommend, we never recommend. But what we're doing is we're saying this is what they want, this is what Cheryl wants, this is what Mr. Baker wants, this is the most important thing to them. And then what we're doing in that report, I think, is making it really hard for the decision maker not to do what they want, because we've put all the reasons why. Now, as long as the decision makers considered it, they might disagree. You know, they might say, okay, I've heard that Mrs. Perkins wants to live at home, but the assessment is that it's just not safe. It's just not safe for her to do that. So the decision isn't for her to move home because it's not in their best interests. That decision might be the right decision. But what I'm there to do is to check that Mrs. Perkins' views have been really taken seriously. And you know as well as I do that sometimes when people lack capacity, and sometimes if you have a disability, you're not taken as seriously. And that's the bit we want to check isn't happening, that the person's views have in some way been dismissed or belittled or reduced because of of their impairment because they lack capacity. That's the bit that we want to really kind of keep on top of. And then the third part of IMCA, like any other type of advocacy, is about checking and challenging where decisions haven't been made properly. So when I say properly, that could be because they've not complied with the Mental Capacity Act. Simplest way to check that is to check the principles of the Mental Capacity Act and the best interest checklist and check that the decision makers followed them. And we cover that in the last webinar. So if you missed that, do check that out because we talk about the principles and the best interest checklist. But these are the types of things that we're checking that the decision maker is followed, and if they haven't, then challenging it. Right. Oh, sorry. Oh, I had all slides there to talk you through, and I've just waffled through. Right. Very quickly, some examples of, so this was thinking around self-advocacy, so really supporting the person to make choices and decisions. I won't read out, you can read it yourself. But these are some things an IMCA, I think, could do. And then moving on to the second one, the representational, definitely through the report. And I suppose what I should say here, just as you're reading this, is don't wait until you report if you've got serious representations. So if something develops that you're really concerned about, or let's say the person wants to go, I mean, the common one is the person wants to go home, the local authority is saying no. You can tell how serious the local authority has taken that request by how they respond. So some social workers are brilliant, at arranging assessments. Okay, let's see how Mrs. Perkins will cope, so we'll arrange an OT assessment to look at that. If they haven't done that and they're kind of dismissing it, I wouldn't be waiting to the report to raise that. I'd be raising it really early. Similarly, the safeguarding concerns, don't wait until you report till you raise that as soon as you have them. And if there's any breaches of human rights or potential breaches of human rights, don't wait until you report, get that in as soon as that happens. Then the check and challenge, so we've kind of covered this. So you're looking at the person's rights, you're looking at the process that the decision maker is going through, and if there's any issues, you raise them. Right then, so that's the end. Look at that, 5 minutes to go. Boom.